Hello and welcome to the second Post-16 Pedagogy in Practice meeting. My name is Pritesh Raichura and I'm the Director of Teaching and Pastoral at Athena Learning Trust down in the southwest of England, and I also am the author at bonsonblue.com. So I'm really excited to be here today. As one of the early founding members of the CogSci community, blogs from which were used by the working group at Hounslow Education Partnership to design the content of the PPP this year. And other HEP teachers are also members of the CogSci community, and it's via that introduction that I've been invited to speak to you to provide a short keynote for your second PPP meeting today. So what I'm hoping to do today is to also link back to some of the content that you would have covered in early October. And for those of you that are involved in these meetings previously, you'll see that I make links to the model of memory and effortful thinking as well from over the course of those previous sessions. I'm very much aware that the audience will consist of teachers at different points in their A-level teaching journey as well. And so for some, this presentation will provide a stimulus and a reminder for deeper discussion. For others, it might be something that you want to explore and read further about. So more specifically, what will I be covering today? I'm going to be talking a bit about last session where you looked at ratio. I'm going to look at two key principles to maximize ratio, but then zoom in and really focus today's session on how we can maximize the amount of thinking that takes place with regards to independent practice that we give to our students at A-level. And then end by looking at, when we're giving feedback to those pupils, how we can ensure that that thinking and participation ratio isn't falling away. And then lastly, I'll end the meeting with a slide that will pose some questions for you to go away and think about in your subject-specific groups. So, first of all, to do a quick review of participation and thinking ratio. What this graph shows is that in any given lesson, we want our students to be participating rather than being passive. So we want them to be far along the x-axis of this graph. We also want them thinking hard and thinking really deeply about the content of our subjects rather than kind of coasting and not being made to think very much. So the higher the proportion of the class that is participating, the higher the participation ratio, and the more all of those students are thinking, the higher the thinking ratio. So what strategies can we use to maximize both the thinking and participation ratio? Well, at one extreme, if we were to only ever ask really simple questions and call upon individuals, then only one student would be answering a question at any given time, and they wouldn't be thinking very much. Basic, really simple recall questions, stuff that we know they already probably know the answer to. So we don't want to be in this quadrant. On the other hand, where we do want to be is the other end of this quadrant, where we've got lots and lots of turn and talk so that everybody is participating. We've got lots of mini whiteboard use, perhaps, to show that everyone is engaging, but we're doing this with really challenging questions. Now, if we were to do those challenging questions, but only ask one or two individuals at any given time, we would be at the top left part of this, where individuals are being challenged, but that means that the participation ratio is really low. And on the other hand, if we were doing loads of simple call or response questions, everyone might be answering, but it would be very simple. So the sweet spot is that top left quadrant. But of course, the big caveat here is that every question that we ask, the thinking and participation that happens depends on what those questions are that we plan and what the student's prior knowledge is. Because the same question for a student for whom this content is completely new might be trickier to someone who's more fluent in that content. So that's a brief reminder of what you looked at last time, specifically in the classroom. And now I want to go on to looking a bit more at independent practice. But first, the kind of grounding principles behind all of this is what I want to cover. The first and most important principle for maximizing thinking and participation in the classroom is to teach explicitly and then ask questions. So lots of you will be very familiar with explicit instruction, but it's so important to foreground what I'm about to say. I think it's important to review some of the key principles. So first, we have this idea that, well, what is learning? Learning is the change in long-term memory. If students are leaving a lesson not really recalling the key facts, or even after a unit of learning having vague recollections of what they've been taught, they have not learnt. So how do you build this durable memory? Well, a really great quote from, I think it's Dan Willingham, is that memory is the residue of thought. The things that people actually remember are the things that we have practiced thinking about while we were learning about them. And so in order to maximize the amount of time that people and students are thinking about content that we want to teach them, it's really important that during the lessons, we are planning explanations and teaching them really explicitly, and lots of questioning along the way, so that every second of that lesson is it gets the students thinking about the content of their subjects. They're thinking about the physics, they're thinking about the literature, they're thinking about the maths that we want them to learn. And this is far superior to activities. Now, I know that very much this was the case for me early in my career. I used to plan all sorts of activities for students to do, whether that's posters around the room and pupils go around picking information up, or doing some sorts of in science, I'm a scientist, so doing some sorts of practical activities where they didn't really understand what they were doing, but I thought that I would develop their sense of kind of discovery, as it were. But of course, pupils, when they do this, are spending their time thinking, where am I going next? Which poster do I look at first? What's the point of this bit of activity? What am I doing? I'm not quite sure. Rather than thinking about the science, rather than thinking about the literature, rather than thinking about the maths. So the question to always ask ourselves when we're planning our lessons and when we're planning independent practice for them to do is, will this maximize the amount of time students are spending thinking about the content and building schema of this content? And so this is the model of learning that I always go back to when thinking about anything to do with teaching and learning. If we conceptualize each bit of knowledge, each chunk of knowledge that we want our students to learn as a node, then through our explanation, we are delivering each node of knowledge to them. But also, we don't just want disparate facts to be stored in their memories. We want those facts to be really well connected to each other, and the relationship between that knowledge be made really clear to our students in their minds, so that they develop genuine understanding. And as they add more knowledge to this schema, their understanding deepens and grows. And we want this to be really well embedded in their minds. So how can we optimize this? Well, we've said, first, give clear explanations and ask lots of questions. But once we've done that and we think we're confident that they have understood the key ideas of our subjects, we need them to go away and practice independently. So independent practice is key to fluency. And that's because, well, questions allow them to practice and think about the content more and more. And this means that that schema becomes more and more embedded in their minds. And the best way to do this is to think about that content maximally by answering tons and tons of questions. You might have come across the phrase shed loads of practice in some of the CogSci blogs. Now, of course, it is true that the questions we ask will vary in how much they get students to think. So what we're going to talk mainly about today is designing a set of questions that ramp up in difficulty and lead to efficient and effective schema building. The more they practice, the more fluent they become, the more embedded and well connected the schema is. So if this is the schema after your explanation, by having more practice, each of those nodes I've represented here getting darker means that they recall those facts, those constituent bits of knowledge more easily, and the connections between those links and those facts become even more secure, so that they're able to fully understand the whole concept, see it in its whole, and the individual bits of knowledge as well. So how do we get there? What techniques can we use to write independent practice questions that maximize the thinking ratio, that maximize the amount of thinking that happens in lessons? I'm going to go over and focus in on 5 techniques that will help us. So the first technique is to vary the amount of retrieval per question. So some questions require more subject knowledge more prior subject knowledge, and some require less. But some questions require the retrieval of only a tiny bit of knowledge, others require more extensive retrieval. So initially, in a set of practice questions, it's worth asking lots of simple questions so they secure each node in that schema individually, and then ask questions that require them to retrieve more of that so that they are able to build their fluency in linking together all of those facts together. This sounds like a really simple thing, but often I think at A-level it's very easy to neglect asking some of the simpler questions because we assume that they master things more quickly. So I'm going to be using some biology examples throughout this talk because I'm a biologist. However, I've chosen a topic that I hope is really closely linked to GCSE. It's on photosynthesis, and I hope that the questions illustrate the principle well. But of course, the second part of this session will be you going away and thinking about how these techniques apply in your subject, and it might be a good springboard for you to have to come up with questions from your own subject disciplines. So a really simple question might be, where in the chloroplast do the light-independent reactions of photosynthesis take place? So just a bit of background, in photosynthesis, at A-level, students learn that there are some parts of that reaction that happen which need light and some parts that don't need light. So this is asking very specifically one fact having been given a really specific cue. So if you think of the blue node on the diagram as a cue, which is the question, and they need to retrieve the purple part of the schema, they just need to remember that, oh, it happens in this part of the chloroplast. But a trickier question that requires more retrieval would be, what are the 2 main reactions in photosynthesis? So the students need to think, oh, there's ones that happen that need light and ones that happen that don't need light. And the question is saying, and where do they each take place within the chloroplast? So they need to be able to decide and define and articulate not just where one part of that reaction, where both parts happen. And so they're retrieving more nodes of that schema in this way. So technique 1, vary the amount of retrieval per question. The second technique is to vary the cues that lead to the same knowledge. So what do I mean by this? One piece of knowledge can be linked to many others in a web of knowledge. If you think back to our schema, a node in the middle is connected to all the facts around it. And different questions can act as different cues that may lead to the same answer. And so the more ways you practice getting to the same bit of knowledge, the more you develop those connections, this fluency and that understanding. So for example, the answer to all of the following questions is the same. What is the green pigment in plant cells called? Well, the answer is chlorophyll. Which substance absorbs light during photosynthesis? Well, the answer is also that green dot in that schema, chlorophyll. But the cue is different. That blue dot represents, the blue node on my diagram represents a different bit of knowledge that leads to that idea of chlorophyll. And another question yet that leads to the same answer, chlorophyll, is which substance's electron is excited first during photosynthesis? And by asking a question in these 3 different ways, we're building that connection to the idea of chlorophyll. And that means that schema is becoming really well embedded through all the different connections are being practiced, not just one. The third technique is to move from the familiar to the unfamiliar. So increasing the amount of application that the students do with the knowledge that they have. So if pupils only ever see the same examples and the same language, because that's the questioning style that we use, they'll find transfer to new context harder. In contrast, if they see knowledge in new contexts and new examples, they begin to distinguish between, well, what are the surface distracting features of these examples and what are the deep things that connect these examples together? So for example, in biology, you might say when there's very little light, when there's low light intensity, why is photosynthesis slower? And they might only need a little bit of knowledge to answer that question. However, this is a question that really challenges their thinking a bit further. because there's bits in this question that maybe they haven't even learned about. Maybe they haven't learned about deep sea algae that live in really, really low light conditions. And the question tells them this information. It says they contain pigments that absorb blue light more efficiently than chlorophyll. Explain how this adaptation helps. And actually, this is requiring them to think about the same knowledge about the rate of photosynthesis, but in a completely different context. They're linking unusual bits of knowledge to bits of knowledge they should be really fluent on. They know rate of photosynthesis really well. Now they're connecting it to a very specific organism in a specific environment. They have to think about a different part of the course even by looking at adaptation. And so these unfamiliar examples help them apply this knowledge, and that is good to have later on in your independent practice because it allows for even more fluency to build within that schema. The fourth technique is to increase the amount of specialist vocabulary. So we can ask very similar things, but one that uses simple, less technical, more straightforward terms because they require less prior knowledge. But if we expect the students to use more specialist vocabulary or to answer questions that contain really specialist language, that's going to require more mastery and students will find that more difficult. So a really simple thing might be, why is light needed for photosynthesis? And the answer to that might require lots of knowledge if you're going to do a thorough job of answering it. But the same question can be asked that requires the same knowledge, but the starting points, which are the purple nodes that we're giving the students, are different because they require more technical language. So explain the role of light in photolysis and photophosphorylation is something that A-level students might find much harder than the first question because they have to fully, there's no cue there which says to them, oh, what you're learning about here is photosynthesis. Tell me about photosynthesis. They have to make that link between these two unique words that are less common and the idea of photosynthesis. The final technique is, over time, we want to increase in that independent practice the amount of element interactivity, or how synoptic that question is. So while some questions require knowledge from a really small domain of knowledge, other questions require pupils to retrieve knowledge from different topics or schema that are even further apart and link them together. So these synoptic questions have what we call higher element interactivity. So rather than just saying, state one product of photosynthesis, where they're thinking about two facts within their schema on photosynthesis, that's really, really straightforward and not got very much interactivity at all. There's one node of knowledge, photosynthesis and product, and the answer might be, for example, glucose. But if you ask them, explain how the products of photosynthesis are used in respiration, well, they're having to think loads about photosynthesis and then link it to something they learned in the previous unit, which is on respiration. And so they're connecting different schemas together. And this is where you develop deep understanding of the subject matter at hand. So we've talked about how to increase thinking and participation ratio in questions. We've also talked about it in terms of independent practice. But now we're going to think about, well, now that the students have done the independent practice questions and we were now marking those answers, let's say, how can we make sure that the techniques that we applied in the classroom over here don't fall apart? We don't forget about these same principles within marking. So when marking simple questions, let's say they were really short phrase answers or they're really straightforward recall questions like we talked about early on, then actually it might save a lot of time for the teacher just to say, the question to answer 1 is this, 2 is this, 3 is this, 4 is this, and get the pupils to tick along. Or even sometimes reveal all the answers under the visualizer or on the board and the students just quickly self-correct. That's going to save a lot of time rather than saying, oh, come on, hands up, let's see who's got the first one. Oh, no, that's not correct. Let's go to the second person. Oh, close. We're not quite there yet. That just wastes a lot of time. If it's straightforward, just tell them. And then what you can do is quickly say, right, we've finished marking those 10 questions. Hands up if you got this answer wrong. Number 1, number 2, number 3. Oh, loads have got number 3 wrong. I'll make a note of that. Number 4, number 5, number 6. Oh, more hands have gone up for number 6. And then you'd say, right, let's quickly go over number 3 and 6. So really making it snappy can be really helpful. For trickier questions, it's really important to specify what each correct marking point is. So saying, okay, here's the answer to question 5. Tick if you said da da da. Tick if you said da da da. And you're being really precise in what the ticks are for. And then you can say, hands up, who got 4 ticks for that one? Good, let's check. Who didn't get the first mark? Who didn't get the second mark? Etc., etc. Sometimes we're tempted to pick a student to share their answer, and that can be really valuable. But if it's a really long answer, it's much better to just put it under the visualizer so that everybody can see and follow, rather than getting them to read it out loud, which makes it much harder to follow. The next tip would be to make sure that you avoid a dialogue with one pupil in the class. If you end up just having a long back and forth with one student, other pupils will start to lose attention. So what you can do instead is each point they share, and you want to give them feedback, use a whole class strategy and say, right, so Josh has said this is the answer, but I'm giving him the feedback that this is the answer. Everyone, with your partner, summarize what mistake did Josh make and what should we do to correct it? Go. So for each learning point, we're increasing the participation ratio significantly. So hopefully those 5 techniques have been useful. I've summarized them on this slide here. And very shortly, you're going to go off into your subject groups to consider these questions. I'll give you a moment to read them now. One of the things I want to draw your attention to is point number 3, which is I've talked about how to design really good independent practice, but now the question to think about is, well, should you be giving that practice at home or spend lesson time doing it? And perhaps one thing that you could do is get students to build that habit of doing independent practice at home and doing feedback in lessons, or doing the simple stuff at home and doing the trickier questions in class so that you can give immediate feedback. But I'll leave you to consider what works best in your subject. Hope you found that useful, and good luck with the discussions that follow.